Angelina Jolie, the uncrowned queen of Hollywood, an icon who bent the trajectory of global cinema. She did not merely win an Academy Award for Girl, Interrupted. She carved her name into history with performances that seemed to alter the very rhythm of the frame. She turned Tomb Raider into a worldwide box office earthquake and rose as the dark sovereign of Maleficent, where a single glance was enough to shape a billion-dollar brand. For more than 2 decades, she stood at the summit of admiration, powerful, razor-edged, and seemingly irreplaceable. Hollywood revered her as the standard of cinematic magnetism. The public watched her. The cameras never left her. Yet behind the legacy the world applauded were harsher chapters. Invisible scars etched into her body, endless legal battles, and mornings when the mirror reflected a truth too stark to evade. Even now, at 50, that light has not abandoned her. It simply no longer protects her. And for the first time, the halo is no longer a refuge. Can she continue to stand firm when the very adoration that once lifted her up begins to erode her from within? If you ever believed the summit was a place of safety, subscribe and stay, because the real story begins when the applause fades. The first lesson Angelina Jolie learned was not love, but absence. She was too young to understand the meaning of goodbye, yet old enough to sense when someone was no longer coming back. There was no explosion, no slammed door, no final embrace, only a disappearance unfolding quietly and remaining. Born on June 4, 1975 in Los Angeles, she entered a family shaped by performance, but the first role placed in her hands was abandonment. When her parents divorced in 1976, she was not yet a year old. The fracture had already formed before she could name it. She and her brother, James Haven, remained with their mother, Marceline Bertrand, who quietly set aside her own acting ambitions and carried her children to Palisades in Rockland County, New York. Her father, John Voight, stepped forward into premieres, applause, interviews, and into rooms where his name was spoken with admiration. His daughter stayed behind with a silence that did not argue, did not rage, only endured. There was no cinematic explosion, no shattered glass, no final confrontation, just a door that stopped opening, again, and again, and again. There was a weight in our home, she would later say. It was not loud. It just never lifted. That weight did not sit politely in a corner. It settled into her bloodstream. It sharpened the way her mother's eyes drifted toward the hallway after dark, as if hope might materialize in the shape of a shadow. It thickened the pause before dinner. It echoed in the stillness after the phone did not ring. She was too young to name betrayal, but old enough to memorize its pattern, the choreography of someone choosing elsewhere. In darkened rooms, washed in the blue flicker of television light, she sat beside her mother, watching films where fathers returned before the credits rolled. In her life, they did not. Even after appearing briefly in Looking to Get Out in 1982, she would insist her desire to act was not inheritance. It was not a daughter chasing a father's spotlight. It was a child trying to construct a world where exits were scripted and arrivals guaranteed. It was forged beside a woman who had buried her own future quietly, without ceremony, to raise 2 children alone. She sacrificed everything for us, Jolie once reflected. I think I learned what losing feels like before I ever understood winning. That sentence is not poetic, it is diagnostic. Loss was her first language. When the family returned to Los Angeles and she enrolled at the Lee Strasberg Theater Institute, training for 2 years and performing on stage, it was not glamour she pursued. It was structure. On stage, departures had cues. Applause meant something ended and something else began. In real life, departures dissolved into echoes. Strength was not a virtue she admired. It was scaffolding against disappearance. Adolescence did not soften her. It stripped her. At Beverly Hills High School, she felt distinctly out of place among classmates from wealthy families, while her own household lived modestly on her mother's reduced income. She often wore second-hand clothing. She was painfully thin, wore glasses and braces, and became an easy target for mockery. Early attempts at modeling ended in rejection, by quietly chipping away at a confidence already fragile. "I felt different in ways I could not explain," she later admitted. Being observed was not the same as belonging. After transferring to Moreno High School, she dressed almost entirely in black, not rebellion, but concealment. Vulnerability felt dangerous. Visibility felt fatal. At 14, she asked her mother if she could live with her boyfriend, not as spectacle, but as a young girl desperate for ground that would not shift beneath her. "I did not really know what normal looked like," she once reflected. "I only knew I did not want to feel hollow." The hollowness did not recede. It deepened. She watched her mother carry sorrow without complaint, and that endurance settled into her like inheritance no one asked for. When emotional pressure swelled beyond language, and she sought sensation simply to confirm she was still there. "There were times I hurt myself just to break through the numbness," she later acknowledged, not dramatically, but plainly. It was not attention she sought. It was proof she had not disappeared inside her own skin. Yet, even in that fragile season, something within her refused extinction. She did not shatter. She hardened. The media would later frame those years as volatility, but the truth was quieter and far more severe. She was learning to survive exposure without protection, to exist without shelter. "I did not grow up feeling safe," she once said, "so I had to create strength from the inside." That admission explains everything that followed. The intensity in her performances, the steadiness in her gaze, the instinct to walk toward the world's most wounded places. That by the time admiration finally reached her, the internal architecture was already sealed, built from absence, reinforced by solitude, tempered in rooms where silence lasted longer than comfort. And perhaps that is why her presence carries such gravity. It is not spectacle. It is survival made visible. She did not step into Hollywood searching for light. She arrived carrying a pulse in her chest that refused to quiet. Acting was never a glittering ambition. It was a door she could close when the dark rose too high inside her ribs. As the daughter of John Voight, she understood the mechanics of applause before she understood herself. Ovations followed patterns. Fracture did not. She did not perform to be worshipped. She performed to relocate pain. Inside women who burned, unraveled, and lived along dangerous edges, she found a framework strong enough to stand. The camera did not strip her bare. It absorbed what she could not name and burned it into image. In Gia, 1998, becoming Gia Karangi did not resemble technique. It felt like digging with bare hands. She did not stage collapse. She stood beside it and refused to step back. "Oh, it wasn't acting," she later said, her voice steady. "It felt like standing at the edge of something I already knew." The brilliance audiences saw was braided with something thinner, more breakable. They called it talent. She understood it as risk. Exposure carries weight. A year later, beneath the glare of stage lights, she held an Academy Award for Girl, Interrupted. The theater rose. Applause surged forward. Flashbulbs split the dark into shards. For a suspended second, the world locked onto her name. Then, it dissolved. The car door sealed. The hotel corridor ran long and muted under patterned carpet. When she shut the suite door, the noise did not enter with her. When the room went still, she would recall, choosing each word as if it might bruise. I could hear myself breathing again. The dress caught lamplight, but the gold statue sat heavy and cold against her skin. She placed it down. Nothing in the room rearranged itself. The mirror did not rise. "I thought the sound would trail behind me," she once admitted, almost amused by her own expectation. It stopped at the threshold. Barefoot, she stood between two versions of herself, the crowned figure and the woman reflected back, smaller, unlit. No lesson announced itself. The night remained quiet. On screen, she refused to sand her edges smooth. There was peril in her stillness, grief braided through the spaces between lines. Audiences leaned in because she did not retreat, but each role asked for something real. "I never set out to be larger than life," she said softly in another interview. "I was trying to keep from disappearing inside it." As admiration intensified, and so did the vigilance required to stay whole. The industry called her fearless. In private, she examined her reflection as if it had been assembled from fragments the world preferred. She kept working, kept stepping into characters lit by fire and fracture, kept standing in the rooms that rose to their feet. By the time Hollywood prepared its crown, she had learned something less visible and more exacting: how to carry the gaze without surrendering what it sought to take. She did not break beneath it. She shifted her balance. And when she enters a frame now, there is no declaration, only the quiet steadiness of someone who has already stood alone in a room where applause could not follow, and remained. For Angelina Jolie, recognition never registered as elevation. Acting was not pursuit. It was oxygen, portioned in a sealed room where the windows did not open. "I didn't walk into this to be admired," she said once, voice level, almost stripped of tone. "I walked in because it was the only place the noise inside me could stand still." There was nothing romantic in that recollection, only restraint. Carrying the name Jon Voight intensified the glare rather than softening it. In casting rooms, she was itemized. Too intense, too strange, too much. Cyborg 2 in 1993 left a mark deep enough for her to step away for a year, unsure whether endurance had been mistaken for talent. Gia in 1998 shifted the air pressure. The Oscar for Girl, interrupted in 1999, confirmed arrival, yet institutional trust hovered inches out of reach. In 2001, the two trajectories intersected: UNHCR, Goodwill Ambassador, and Tomb Raider approaching $275 million worldwide. Headlines cast her in bronze. Figures climbed. So did compression, 14-hour stunt days, flights cutting through time zones between sets and refugee camps, sleep rationed into fragments, wrists iced until numb, ribs mottled beneath leather, shoulders cinched by wire rigs. "I pushed past what was smart," she admitted later. "Some nights I couldn't tell what was mine anymore." The image widened. The footing inside it thinned. Beyond Borders in 2003 erased the line between portrayal and presence. When crews wrapped, she remained. Cambodia, Ethiopia, later Vietnam, where heat pressed against the lungs and children gripped her sleeves inside tents stitched from tarp and rope. Cameras at sunrise, camps at dusk. This adoption did not slow the tempo. It anchored it. Weeks folded into 16-hour days, 3 flights in 4 days, scripts studied beneath cabin lights while strangers slept. In a mighty heart, in 2007, grief entered her posture so completely that critics lowered their volume, even when ticket sales did not follow. "The lights never show the whole room," she said quietly. "There's always something outside the frame." By 2014, Maleficent had surpassed $750 million worldwide, its sequel pushing the franchise beyond $1 billion combined. Spectacle was indisputable. So was gravity. After premieres, Gowns lay across chairs like armor unfastened. At 3:17 a.m., barefoot against dense carpet, she sat upright, pulse visible at her throat, breath shallow, fingers steadying as she removed her earrings. And the gold statue on the dresser caught the lamplight without offering warmth. It returned her face without recognition. The air conditioner hummed. Her heartbeat refused to slow. Sleep waited elsewhere. There were nights the quiet felt louder than the crowd, she recalled. I would sit there and feel the room getting smaller. Revenue did not follow her upstairs. Acting steadied her. Acting collected. As totals rose into the billions, the subtraction became exact. After her divorce from Brad Pitt in 2017, she declined theatrics. I wasn't as solid as people believed, she said softly. I had to rebuild where no one could see. She stepped back, children before premieres, stillness before spectacle. Eternals in 2021 crossed roughly $400 million globally, yet scale no longer shielded the inward weight. Like some roles stay in the bloodstream, you have to breathe differently afterward. Not every project ascended. Some stalled. Critics questioned restraint, direction, choice. She did not pivot toward comfort. She continued toward meaning. With Maria and the work that followed, history settled into her voice. Time had not diluted the current, only deepened its undertow. At the 2025 Palm Springs Film Festival, she told young artists, without polish, "This industry can take more than you expect. Guard what matters." It sounded less like counsel than memory. What endures is not sheen, but stamina, not brilliance, but containment. She stands in rooms that detonate for her and in camps that do not. Posture, unaltered. Revenues can be counted. Applause can be measured. What departs leaves no echo. Then her story is not ascent, but equilibrium, the discipline of remaining upright as admiration gathers weight. In a culture engineered for projection, the image kept enlarging. She did not step out of it. She learned how to breathe inside it. By the mid-2000s, Angelina Jolie was no longer merely admired. She had become a force powerful enough to tilt the entire room in her direction. Hollywood did not simply applaud her, it adjusted to her. And it was precisely at that altitude, where cameras never blinked and expectations never slept, that something far more personal began. The year was 2004. The film was Mr. and Mrs. Smith. What started as controlled choreography and calculated chemistry slipped almost imperceptibly into something unscripted and irreversible. Brad Pitt was still married to Jennifer Aniston. Jolie had only just steadied herself after years of inner upheaval. The press tightened around them like air before a storm, but she did not fracture in public. She stood firm in what she believed, as repeating words rooted in childhood memory. Knowing what infidelity did to my mother, I could never step into someone else's marriage. I would not choose a man willing to wound his wife. Those words were not strategy. They were scar tissue speaking. Yet life doesn't bend to clean convictions. The moment that changed everything didn't look dramatic. It was disarmingly simple. One afternoon, Maddox, too young to understand headlines, looked up at Pitt and said, "Daddy." No music swelled. No cameras rolled. Jolie would later recall it with a softness that carried weight. He said it without hesitation. Brad and I looked at each other, and something shifted inside me. It felt small and absolute. In that second, she was not a global icon navigating controversy. She was a mother hearing the future in her child's voice, and the air did not explode. It grew heavier. And from that quiet weight, a family began, not like a whirlwind, but like a door closing gently behind a choice that could never be taken back. In the years that followed, their lives braided together not just through love, but through responsibility. They moved across refugee camps and reconstruction zones with children in tow, raising a family in places the world preferred not to look at. Zahara from Ethiopia, Pax from Vietnam, then Shiloh, Knox, and Vivienne. Their home expanded under the weight of intention. The wedding at Chateau Miraval in 2014 was intimate to the point of vulnerability, the children sketching the veil, carrying the rings with solemn hands, writing fragments of vows that spoke more of permanence than spectacle. Pitt once said, without hesitation, "They are my children in every way that matters. I cannot imagine my life without them." To the world, they appeared aligned. She serving as a UNHCR ambassador, he rebuilding through the Make It Right Foundation. It looked like balance. It required constant strength. The reckoning came in 2013 not with headlines but with a genetic report carrying her name. BRCA1 was just a sequence of letters. What it implied was not abstract. The percentages were cold, precise, indifferent to fame. The choice before her was surgical and irreversible. A preventive double mastectomy was not framed in language of courage. It was framed in proximity to her children's future. The hospital lights were unforgiving. Forms waited for her signature. The room did not care who she was. Pitt sat beside her, quiet, absorbing what neither of them tried to dramatize. Later, she would admit, in a voice stripped of performance, "There were nights I lay awake and felt the outline of what I was about to lose, but I understood what mattered more." In another reflection, she said, "I wanted my children to grow up knowing I chose presence over fear." Recovery did not feel triumphant. It felt necessary. Laughter surfaced, but it was deliberate, an act of defiance against uncertainty. For a time, love and survival moved side by side, clutching the same fragile ground as if either one might fall first. The public saw devotion lit brightly, mistaking endurance for peace. What stayed hidden was the private fatigue of standing steady after crossing a threshold no applause could warm. Love had become a shelter built by choice, sealed with vows and children and shared wars against the world. But shelters do not stop the seasons. Even the strongest walls thin in unnamed cold. Gradually, without noise or spectacle, the air inside began to change. So quietly, they did not notice until they were already shivering, facing a winter they could no longer endure together. For many years, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt stood as an unshakable symbol. 6 children, journeys through war zones, a love story the public treated as destiny, their image bearing a narrative people held onto as proof that fame and family could coexist without fracture. But symbols crack under pressure. In September 2016, at 30,000 feet, suspended between metal and white cloud, admiration protected no one. What composure had concealed began to splinter inside a sealed cabin with no exit. The aircraft narrowed into a corridor of escalation, details still contested. Yet one fact endures. While the engines roared steadily on, it was not the plane that broke apart, but the myth of an untouchable family. The emotion is less disputed. It was not merely conflict, it was the animal certainty that something inside that cabin had tipped into danger. Years later, her voice held steel instead of tremor when she said, "I chose what I believed would keep my children safe. Nothing else could come first." It was not theater. It was a threshold. Within days, she filed for divorce, an act that did not simply end a marriage but dismantled the architecture of the only home her children had known. The FBI opened an investigation. No criminal charges were filed against Pitt. Still, one child was reportedly injured. A brief line in legal records, yet an image that refused erasure. Paper can record an event, It cannot contain the sound of a mother replaying a moment at 3 a.m., searching for the second when ordinary life turned irreversible. Courtrooms followed. Headlines fed. But the deeper rupture lived elsewhere, in a kitchen once sweet with syrup and laughter, now echoing with absence, in hallways where memory floated like dust in angled light. "There are nights I close my eyes and I'm back there," she later admitted, her tone stripped to bone. "You recognize the instant when your life divides into before and after." Her body kept score on what she refused to dramatize. Hypertension, temporary facial paralysis, a frame thinned by strain and photographed without context. She did not campaign for sympathy. She reduced her world to what she could shield. As the spotlight dimmed, her vigilance sharpened. That flight was not only crisis, it was revelation. Admiration cannot intercept harm, and love, at its fiercest, may dismantle the structure it once fought to preserve. She did not leave softly. When she stepped forward carrying 6 names like a vow beneath her ribs, she emerged marked and altered, but intact. It was not spectacle that came next, but attrition, resilience measured in court dates, legal briefs, and the quiet forfeiture of privacy. When Jolie filed for divorce in September 2016, the public reacted. She had already crossed her private line. "It was the hardest line I have ever drawn," she later said. "I did not draw it in anger. I drew it because I could not ignore what my children were feeling." Pitt sought joint custody, and a legal battle stretched nearly 8 years. She spoke rarely, and when she did, restraint carried weight. "I stayed quiet so my children could breathe." Silence is not surrender. It is protection. Courtroom after courtroom, leaked emails, parsed motions, she moved through it without theatrics. But meanwhile, the children matured beneath scrutiny they never chose. Maddox reportedly cut contact with his father after that flight. Pax followed with distance of his own. Zahara later removed Pitt from her college registration. Picture the stillness. A document laid flat, a pen lowered, a signature released with deliberation. Not rebellion, decision. Jolie did not publish a memoir. She did not mount a public campaign. "There are versions of our story that are not mine to correct," she acknowledged. "My children carry the truth of what they lived, and that is enough." In that discipline, her life recalibrated. Strength no longer rose from applause. It came from repetition, waking, showing up, absorbing impact without passing it on. "Any strength I have now comes from the responsibility to love them well," she said elsewhere. "Though it doesn't depend on what I receive back. No sermon, no spectacle, just constancy." When the storm thinned, what remained was not the wreckage of a celebrity romance, but the outline of a mother who placed herself between her children and the fallout. Headlines will archive themselves. Legal documents will persist. In the quieter reckoning, the measure is simpler and harder. 6 young adults stepping forward with chosen names and defined boundaries. Not a fairy tale, not a ruin. Something forged and meant to endure. When the marriage ended, the quiet was not peace, it was exposure. Every sound inside her body grew louder. The house slept, her pulse did not. It thudded in her ears, insistent, unruly, as if knocking to be let out. Hypertension, the doctors labeled it. Treatable, trackable, ordinary. But there is nothing ordinary about lying awake at 3 a.m., palm pressed to your chest, wondering why your own heart feels like a stranger. She would later describe those nights with restraint. "Wasn't panic. Was awareness too much of it? I could hear myself existing." Then came the morning that altered the symmetry of her world. Pale light, mirror, attempted smile, only half complied. The other half remained distant, unreachable. Bell's palsy. No dramatic collapse, just stillness where motion used to live. I kept telling my face, "May come back," she once reflected, voice measured but edged with memory. And when it didn't, I realized control is a myth we rehearse. She studied herself longer than vanity would ever require. It wasn't about beauty, she clarified years later. It was the fear that my children would sense something slipping before I could name it. Her fingers hovered over the unmoving skin as if mapping unfamiliar terrain. In that bathroom, under unforgiving light, she confronted a quiet terror. Strength can thin without warning. And when it does, no one applauds the effort it takes just to stand upright. The numbers arrived without emotion. BRCA1, an 87% lifetime risk of breast cancer. Probability dressed as prophecy. Statistics do not hold children at night. Mothers do. In 2013, she chose a preventive double mastectomy, not because courage erased fear, but because fear clarified priorities. The night before surgery, she once shared in reflection, I lay still and imagined the years I wanted to earn. Sleep never settled. She memorized the rise and fall of her breath as if storing it. The operating room glared with clinical indifference. Consent signed. Lights overhead, a body intact. Then anesthesia. When she woke, the absence was both physical and philosophical. She had removed what might one day harm her, but also what had long been part of her womanhood. You don't just lose tissue, she later expressed carefully. You renegotiate who you are. 2 years later, in 2015, she faced another threshold, the removal of her ovaries and fallopian tubes, in a decision that quietly closed the chapter of future pregnancies. There is a grief that doesn't scream, she reflected in her own understated cadence. It sits beside you, asking if you are certain, and you answer yes even with tears you refuse to dramatize. Hormones shifted, energy recalibrated, time felt more finite and more precious. The applause that followed her public disclosure traveled continents. It did not travel into recovery rooms. It did not accompany her the first time she traced the surgical lines across her skin. She touched them not as damage, but as declarations, marks of a promise kept. I will stay. Some perceived distance in her afterward. She understood the interpretation. I learned to move with intention, she explained once. Did not colder, just unwilling to collapse. Her transparency ignited global conversations about genetic testing and cancer prevention. Women sought screenings, families examined histories once ignored. But the deepest heroism unfolded in small, unseen gestures. Packing lunches while healing, attending school functions as her body adjusted to abrupt hormonal change, answering difficult questions with steadiness she sometimes had to manufacture. Femininity did not dissolve. It evolved under pressure. Identity did not fracture. It was reforged with deliberate hands. The world will archive the premieres and the gowns. What endures is less glamorous and more indelible. A woman in front of a mirror at dawn, half her face unmoving, heart unsteady, choosing not to disappear. A mother consenting to loss in order to extend presence. A human being accepting scars so her children would have years. Not because she was fearless, but because love outweighed fear. And in that calculus, conducted without spectacle, she did not diminish. She deepened. Today, at 50 years old, Angelina Jolie stands not merely as a global icon, but as a woman who learned how loud admiration can feel when it stops outside a closed door. Her estimated net worth is widely reported to be around $120 million, shaped by decades of blockbuster films, directing work, brand partnerships, and long-game decisions that favored stability over spectacle. The numbers are easy to repeat. Tomb Raider nearing $275 million worldwide, Maleficent surging past $750 million, Eternals crossing roughly $400 million. But the quieter truth is how that scale compresses a life. Money becomes insulation, yes, but it also becomes measurement. What you can control, what you can't, what you still carry home when the cameras are gone. The coldest part is this: fame can pay for comfort without ever purchasing calm. You see, her most significant tangible anchor remains her Los Feliz estate in Los Angeles, purchased for about $24.5 million, a historic Beaux-Arts compound often linked to early Hollywood legend, stretching over 11,000 square feet on more than 2 acres. 6 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, formal rooms that hold silence as easily as they hold guests, a grand library, gardens, terraces, old Hollywood scale, but built for a modern purpose. 6 children, a mother, and the need for both togetherness and escape. The home reads like protection: high walls of greenery, layered spaces, rooms that allow a person to disappear without leaving. Reports have long suggested she may relocate internationally once her youngest children reach adulthood. That timeline sharpens in 2026 when the twins reach 18 and the last legal tether of childhood loosens. And in the past, she also shared ownership of Chateau Miraval in France and once owned a New Orleans property that later sold for about $2.8 million. Assets that, on paper, look like freedom, but in real life often function like chapters you can't close quickly. Even the question of cars says something. There is no reliable public inventory of her current vehicles, but she is more often seen in practical, high-end SUVs fit for family movement, not flashy display. Her wealth is real, so is the restraint around it. Her daily life now moves with a different tempo than the years of relentless premieres. Much of it orbits her children, some in university, some building private lives, some still under her roof, and the public moments that surface often show her beside one of them, not posed, but present. That pattern is its own statement. Red carpets become less about arrival and more about attendance. Health has also shaped her rhythm. She has spoken publicly about preventive surgeries tied to cancer risk, and later about stress taking physical form. At 50, her beauty reads less like reinvention and more like maintenance: minimal makeup, understated clothes, a steadiness that looks earned. She doesn't sell a fantasy of effortless youth. She appears like someone who has learned the cost of running too fast for too long and chooses quiet when she can. If you watch closely, the message is not spoken, it's scheduled. Professionally, she no longer operates at the velocity of her peak years. She operates at precision: acting, directing, advocacy. Each now appears less frequent, but more deliberate. Her 2001 appointment as a UNHCR Goodwill Ambassador did not remain ceremonial. It evolved into decades of field missions, policy engagement, and sustained financial support, consistently described in the range of multi-million-dollar contributions. The exact cumulative totals are not neatly itemized in a single public ledger, yet the pattern is unmistakable. This was never episodic philanthropy, it was structural involvement. Her artistic choices reflect the same calibration. Portraying Maria Callas in Maria signals not a return to spectacle, but an embrace of interiority, roles that demand restraint, but psychological density and risk rather than box office certainty. She no longer competes for ubiquity, she curates impact. Appearances are measured, premieres selected, advocacy trips intentional. Even her public schedule bends around school calendars and security logistics, suggesting a life engineered for balance rather than applause. In a culture that monetizes constant visibility, her most consequential moves seem quieter, arranged rather than announced, constructed rather than performed. unfolding beyond the appetite of spectacle. What defines Angelina Jolie today is not the $120 million estimate, nor the square footage, nor the box office totals. It's the way she keeps living inside what those numbers can't solve. Her life suggests a hard human equation. Admiration expands the image, and the person underneath has to learn how to keep breathing at the same size. If her journey reveals anything, it is how survival can evolve into strategy, and strategy into legacy. When the mirror shifts, when the numbers arrive, when silence grows louder than applause. Something beneath the surface is either reinforced or quietly tested, and what stands there is rarely visible. In the end, estates can be sold, vehicles replaced, portfolios rebalanced, but certain things do not transfer so easily. Presence, courage, the interior steadiness that remains when the audience fades. Perhaps the truest net worth was never the valuation at all. Perhaps it is the life that continues, intact, even when no one is watching.